I'd lived in the house for 6 years before I ever noticed him. That sounds absurd, I know, but it's true. Every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, the truck would roll up around 8:45 a.m., backfiring like it had no business still running, and 2 or 3 guys would jump out and start tending to the yard. They handled everything: lawn, hedges, weeding, cleanup, and I never once paid attention to their faces. I was the kind of guy who paid the invoice online and waved vaguely from behind the blinds if anyone rang the bell. I worked from home, kept mostly to myself, and liked it that way. But this past spring, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the sun hit the street that morning. Maybe I'd just been lonely too long. Or maybe I just finally looked up from my laptop at the right moment. There he was, standing just outside the hedge line, holding a pair of gas-powered shears, backlit by the early light. You know when someone's just magnetic? Not movie star handsome, but something about them pulls at you? That was him. He looked young, maybe early 20s, with this messy dark brown hair that kept falling in his eyes while he worked. He'd push it back with the back of his glove, then get right back to snipping like he was sculpting something that mattered. He wore a navy blue t-shirt, damp with sweat down the spine, clinging in all the right ways. Athletic build, tan. Not bulky, but lean, wiry. Kind of the way I used to be 10 years ago. I caught myself staring. Then I caught myself doing it again the next week. I started calling him Hedge Guy in my head. I still didn't know his name, and I wasn't about to go outside just to make small talk. That felt way too obvious. But I rearranged my schedule so I could work from the dining table on Tuesdays instead of the office, because from there, I had the perfect view of the yard. I told myself it wasn't creepy. I told myself it was curiosity. But the truth was, I hadn't really noticed anyone like that in a long time. After my last relationship, if you could call it that, I'd settled into a kind of numb comfort. Quiet house, quiet job, quiet life. 38 years old, no kids, no partner, no drama, just podcasts and frozen meals, and the occasional weekend hike when I remembered to touch grass. I think I'd convinced myself that was enough, but then there was him, working under the sun like he had nowhere else in the world to be, and something about that cracked the shell I'd built around myself. I didn't even know if he was gay. I wasn't stupid. Guys like that didn't usually swing my way, but then again, I wasn't trying to find out. I wasn't planning anything. I just kept watching. Quietly. One Tuesday, about 3 weeks into my newly found routine of low-key obsession, the truck pulled up later than usual. I just started to assume they weren't coming when I saw him, alone this time, pull up in an old blue pickup. He got out, stretched like he'd been driving a while, then went straight to work. He wasn't in the usual company truck, just his own beat-up Ford with a ladder and tools in the back. That was new. And then he did something that made my heart stutter. He looked directly at the window, not a glance. A look, like he knew I was there. I ducked without meaning to, heart racing like a teenager who got caught staring at the quarterback in the locker room. My coffee sloshed in my hand and splashed down my shirt, but I didn't even care. When I peeked again, he was back to trimming, but the smirk on his face said everything. He knew, and I think he didn't mind. The week after that, I found myself anticipating Tuesday mornings in a way that made me uncomfortable. Not because I was bored, but because I couldn't stop thinking about him. Jesse. That's the name I finally learned when the neighbor mentioned it while watering his own tulips. Jesse. It fit him. Young, efficient, a little reckless, and sharp-eyed in a way that made you feel like he could read you before you even moved your lips. That Tuesday, the air was warmer than usual. The sun reflected off the wet grass, and I sat by the window with my coffee, pretending to work on an email while listening to the rhythmic hum of his shears. Jesse moved with deliberate precision, bending low to snip the hedge, standing to straighten the rows, shoulders taut, calves flexing as he shifted his weight. I swear, the guy made hedge trimming look graceful. I tried not to imagine what it would be like to be closer, to talk to him, to brush a hand against his, just for a second. My pulse jumped at the thought, and I realized that this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something far more primal. Later, he packed up, carrying the trimmer back to his truck. I watched him from the window as he wiped his hands on a rag, the muscles in his arms rippling, droplets of sweat catching the light. And I will never forget this. He paused mid-step and looked directly at me again. No casual glance this time. His eyes lingered. For a long beat, maybe two. Then he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. My stomach lurched. What did it mean? Was he flirting? Was I imagining things? I tried to focus on my screen, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about that look. And for the first time, I realized I wanted to know him. Not just see him across the yard, but really know him. Learn the rhythm of his mornings. The tilt of his head when he concentrated. The sound of his voice when he spoke casually. A few days later, I found my excuse. The back gate had been acting up for weeks. It stuck on the latch, and I'd been meaning to fix it myself, but never got around to it. Then I remembered Jesse's smirk. That confident, I know something you don't, smirk. I knew he'd notice it, and I wanted him to. So, Tuesday morning, I lingered by the door as if I were checking the mailbox, phone in hand. When the truck pulled up, he stepped out with that same purposeful stride, and I almost swallowed my tongue. The sun hit him just right, highlighting the sharp planes of his jaw, the tan of his arms, the way his chest rose and fell in a rhythm that somehow matched the fluttering of my heart. "Morning," I said, too loud. My voice cracked. "Perfect." He glanced up, saw me, and grinned. That grin, the one that made you feel like a private joke existed just between the two of you, and my knees went weak. "Morning, Mr. Hedges," he said. Cheeky, playful. My pulse spiked. I gestured toward the gate. "You're not busy today, are you? Think you could take a look at this?" He raised an eyebrow. "Gate trouble?" His tone was light, teasing, and I could see the glint in his eye. "Sure, lead the way." We walked together to the backyard. His proximity made my skin prickle. I kept pretending to inspect the gate, while my eyes flicked to his every movement. He crouched, examined the latch, and then looked up at me with a smile that made my chest tighten. "It's a bit rusty," he said, and for some reason, the way he said it made me ache. "But I can fix it. You mind if I get my toolkit?" I shook my head. "Go ahead. I've been meaning to." He worked silently for a few minutes, the sounds of hammering and twisting filling the quiet yard. I couldn't focus on anything else but him. Watching him move, the subtle flex of his forearms, the way his shirt clung when he bent over, it was distracting in the best possible way. Finally, he straightened and wiped his hands on the rag again. "There," he said, satisfied. "Good as new. Shouldn't stick anymore." I wanted to thank him, not just for fixing the gate, but for existing in my yard, for making me feel this way. So I did the only thing I could think of. I leaned a little closer than necessary. "Thanks," I said softly. "Seriously." He caught my gaze. That grin lingered. "Anytime," he said, then turned toward the truck. But before he climbed in, he paused. "See you next week, Mr. Hedges." I watched him go, chest tight, heart hammering, and realized something terrifying. I was looking forward to next week, and the week after that, and every week after. The next Tuesday, I found myself waiting a little earlier than usual. My coffee was cold in the mug, my laptop open, but I wasn't working. I was watching the street, and then, just like clockwork, the old blue truck rolled up. Jesse hopped out, stretching like he hadn't moved all morning, and I swear my chest skipped a beat at the sight. "Morning, Mr. Hedges," he called, tossing a rag over his shoulder. His grin had this faint spark, a teasing edge that made me feel both ridiculous and magnetic all at once. "Morning," I mumbled, not trusting my voice. I almost wanted to tell him to stop being so casually perfect, but I didn't. I just watched. This time, he didn't start trimming immediately. He came around the side of the house, pretending to adjust something in the bed of his truck. I swore he lingered a little too long, just far enough that our eyes met through the kitchen window. That look, direct, sharp, aware, made my stomach knot. By mid-morning, the sun was climbing, the smell of fresh-cut grass thick in the air. He crouched by the hedges near the back fence, and I realized I was holding my breath. I didn't even know why. I was just mesmerized. Every small movement of his hands, every tilt of his head, the way his shirt clung at the shoulders when he leaned forward. I couldn't stop watching. I caught myself leaning closer to the window, almost uncomfortably. My reflection stared back at me, pale, nervous, a little embarrassed. But it didn't matter. My eyes stayed on him. Then something happened that made my chest slam. He straightened and winked. I froze, winked at me from across the yard, like it was some private joke. I stumbled back, heart hammering, hands shaking slightly as I gripped the edge of the counter. Did he just? Could he actually? The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I went about my work, glancing surreptitiously through the blinds, watching Jesse trim, rake, sweep. Every time he looked my way, every brief glance, every smile, it sent a jolt of warmth through me, the kind that had nothing to do with the sun or the sweat on his back. By the time he packed up, I was trembling slightly, not just from anticipation, but from the way my thoughts had spun all morning. He walked toward his truck slowly, almost lazily, tossing the shears in the bed with a casualness I couldn't even process. And then, right before he climbed in, he turned his head toward the window and said something just loud enough for me to hear. "Nice house, by the way." I choked back a laugh. That was it. Just casual, friendly. But the way he said it, the weight behind the tone, the way his eyes held mine, it was different, personal, charged. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just curious anymore. I didn't just want to watch him work. I wanted to know him, to touch him, to hear his voice closer, to see if that wink was a one-time thing or an invitation. Over the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything. Emails blurred. Meetings I attended online felt distant. I kept replaying that wink in my head, over and over, imagining different scenarios, some bold, some stupid. And then came Tuesday again. And with it, the sound of the truck pulling up, the smell of fresh-cut grass, the sight of him leaning over the hedges, hair falling into his eyes. This time, I went outside, just for a second, just enough to feel the air, the warmth of the morning, the proximity, and he noticed. I felt his eyes on me as I walked down the driveway, and my pulse spiked. "Need some help with that last row?" I asked, gesturing to the hedge he had just finished trimming. My voice sounded braver than I felt. He glanced up, one eyebrow raised, and then smiled. That same grin, but broader this time, softer, like he was waiting for me to try something. "Sure," he said, "if you really want." I stepped closer, trying to pretend I was inspecting the shape of the hedge, but my hands were shaking slightly. And Jesse leaned down, standing almost within reach, glancing at the hedge and then back at me. Just for a moment, just a second, our hands brushed as he adjusted a branch. That little contact, accidental or intentional, I didn't care, sent a shock through me, warm and electric. I knew right then. I was in trouble. And I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. The next Tuesday felt like it stretched for hours before he even arrived. I made a conscious effort to act normal. Coffee in hand, checking emails, pretending to work at my desk. But I couldn't stop glancing out the window. Every sound of tires on gravel made my chest jump. Then I saw the truck, the familiar blue of Jesse's old Ford. He hopped out, towel slung over his shoulder, water bottle in hand, moving toward the hedges with that casual, confident stride. My stomach flipped. This time, I didn't stay inside. I told myself I'd just check the gutters. It was a lie. I was really checking how close I could get without looking obvious. He noticed immediately. There was that tilt of the head, the small, knowing smile, the one that always made my pulse spike. "Morning, Mr. Hedges," he said, voice low, casual, but somehow charged. "Morning," I mumbled, voice cracking slightly. God, why did he have to sound like that? I walked toward him, keeping my eyes on the hedge he was trimming, but my mind was all over the place. I was hyper-aware of the space between us, just a few feet, but it felt like an impossible distance. "Careful with that branch," I said, gesturing to a particularly thick stem near the corner. He looked at me, quirked an eyebrow, and I realized I was standing far too close. "I can handle it," he said, moving slightly toward me to cut the branch, and that's when it happened. Our hands brushed. Just lightly, just for a second, but enough to send a shiver through me. He froze too, just for a heartbeat, then pulled back slightly, a small smirk on his lips. I wanted to laugh at myself for noticing, but I couldn't. My pulse was racing, my palms sweating. The morning passed in a blur. Every time he adjusted a hedge, every time he bent or stretched, every time he looked up at me, it was like a private game, subtle, wordless, and entirely electric. Finally, he finished the last row. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his rag. "All done," he said. But he didn't move toward the truck yet. Instead, he looked at me. Really looked. "Do you, want to check the backyard fountain?" he asked casually. My stomach dropped. Casual? Nothing about his tone was casual. I knew it. "Sure," I said, trying to act composed. My legs felt like jelly. We walked together behind the house. The fountain was small, decorative, but it had this secluded corner tucked away by the arbor. He crouched down to check the water level, and I stepped closer to help, though I wasn't sure what I was helping with. That's when it happened. He leaned over, brushing his hand, intentionally I think, against mine while adjusting the fountain. The contact lingered a second longer than it should have. Our eyes met. And for a moment, we didn't speak. The air was thick, heavy, and charged with something I hadn't felt in years. Desire, hesitation, something raw and unspoken. Thanks," I managed, voice lower than intended. "Anytime," he said, voice soft, almost intimate. And then, the moment I'd been both dreading and longing for, he leaned just slightly closer. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the faint scent of sweat and sunscreen, and something uniquely him. My heart was hammering. My mind screamed to step back, but I didn't. He didn't either. For a few seconds that stretched too long, we just stood there, inches apart, breathing the same warm air, and I realized something terrifying. I wanted him. I wanted this tension, this closeness, this dangerous edge, more than I'd wanted anything in a long, long time. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled back, smiled that lopsided, teasing smile, and said, "Better finish trimming the side yard before it gets too hot." I blinked, chest tight, trying to process what had just happened. And as he walked away, that same magnetic energy followed him, lingering in the quiet backyard. I stayed there for a long time, heart racing, palms clammy, thinking about the way his eyes had held mine. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't going to be just a passing fascination. This was something much bigger, something I wasn't ready to name. And I didn't want to be ready, not yet. The next week, I did something I hadn't done before. I lingered at the window, as if I were casually tidying the blinds. But really, I was waiting. Waiting for Jesse. My heart had somehow learned the rhythm of his truck, the sound of his footsteps, the faint jangle of tools in the bed of his truck. By mid-morning, the sky had turned a pale gray. A light drizzle began to fall, fat droplets bouncing off the grass. Normally, I would have stayed inside, but there was a strange thrill in the idea of being caught outside in the rain. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was him. Probably both. Jesse showed up right on schedule, hood pulled over his hair, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He looked good, even in a wet hoodie. He gave me that glance, the one that made me feel like he could see every single thought I hadn't spoken, and my knees went weak. "I didn't think you'd actually come out," he called, voice carrying over the soft patter of rain. "Yeah, well, thought I'd check the roof," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the back. My mind was racing. I hadn't been on the roof since last fall, and I wasn't even sure why I mentioned it, but the idea of him nearby, close, watching, was intoxicating. "Roof, huh?" He grinned. "Need a hand?" I hesitated. Roofs and ladders weren't really my thing, but the suggestion in his tone made my pulse spike. I nodded. "Sure, I guess." We climbed the ladder together, and I could feel his presence so close, shoulder brushing mine, hand occasionally just grazing the small of my back as he steadied the ladder. I felt myself tense, not with fear, but anticipation. When we reached the flat part of the roof, rain slicking the shingles beneath our feet, the air was thick with tension. He knelt to check a loose tile near the edge, and I leaned over slightly to help. Our arms brushed again, longer this time, and neither of us pulled away immediately. I swallowed hard. "Thanks," I murmured. "Any time," he said, voice low, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it against my ear. His hand lingered near mine, almost brushing it again before he pulled back, just slightly, just enough to tease. The rain intensified, the sky darkened, and the whole world seemed to shrink down to just the two of us. I realized I could see the drops clinging to his lashes, water tracing faint lines down his jaw, and my chest tightened in a way that made it hard to breathe. "Careful," I said, my voice almost shaky. "It's slippery up here." He glanced at me, eyes catching mine, and the teasing smirk softened into something unreadable. "I'm careful," he said, and I couldn't tell if it was reassurance or a challenge. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the task at hand. The tiles, the gutters, whatever excuse I could use to justify being this close. But the thought of how close we already were, the tension between us, the subtle electricity in the air, made it impossible to concentrate. And then, without warning, he leaned closer, his arm brushing mine intentionally, fingers grazing mine, just for a heartbeat. My chest seized, my throat went dry. I couldn't look away, he didn't either. The moment stretched impossibly long, and then he pulled back, just a little, just enough to make me ache for more. "Almost done here," he said casually, though neither of us sounded casual. I nodded, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, but I hadn't. And I knew in the pit of my stomach that nothing would ever be the same again. The rain fell harder, the world around us blurring, and I realized something terrifying. I didn't want this to stop. Not the rain, not the roof, not him. The following Tuesday, I didn't even bother pretending I was busy inside. I waited by the back door, leaning casually against the frame, trying to look nonchalant while my chest raced. The moment I saw Jesse's truck pull up, I felt that familiar jolt, a mix of anticipation and something far deeper I hadn't allowed myself to name. He climbed out, hood off this time, hair damp from the morning mist, eyes scanning the yard. And then, as if he'd been waiting for me, they landed on mine. That smile, small, knowing, just enough to make my knees weak, made me forget how to breathe. "Morning, Mr. Hedges," he called, tossing a pair of gloves over his shoulder. The casualness in his tone did nothing to mask the underlying charge between us. "Morning," I replied, voice tighter than I wanted. We moved toward the hedges together. The air was heavy, warm, almost fragrant, with freshly cut grass and the faint smell of him. Soap, sun, something earthy I couldn't place. Every small movement felt like an intimate ritual. Every bend of his back, every stretch to clip a branch, every glance over his shoulder sent a shiver down my spine. Then it happened. I leaned down to inspect a thick section of hedge he was working on, and our hands brushed again. This time, it wasn't accidental. Fingers intertwined, palm against palm, the touch lingering. My chest hammered. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the tension vibrating between us in a way that was impossible to ignore. He froze for a heartbeat, then slowly, deliberately his hand shifted, brushing my wrist, tracing the line of my forearm. I wanted to pull away. My mind screamed at me to step back, to remember boundaries, but my body refused. "Jesse," I breathed, my voice catching. His gaze met mine, steady, unwavering. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made my heart clench. "I know," he said softly. Just that word, and it said everything. The quiet of the backyard wrapped around us. No one was coming. The usual hum of the neighborhood faded. All I could hear was the rapid thrum of my pulse and the subtle brush of his hand against mine. Then he leaned in, just slightly, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath. My stomach dropped. My chest ached. I realized, with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, that I wanted him, this tension, this moment, more than I'd wanted anything in years. He didn't kiss me. Not yet. But the faint pressure of his hand, the way he leaned into me, the subtle heat of his body so close to mine, it was enough to make the world tilt. Enough to make me ache. "Careful," I whispered, though neither of us moved apart. "I'm careful," he replied, voice low, almost a purr. Time seemed to stretch. The mundane task of hedge trimming, something I'd watched him do for weeks, became irrelevant. All that mattered was the electricity between us, the unspoken understanding, the first real spark that made the quiet mornings impossibly charged. And then finally, as if we'd both been holding back for weeks, he stepped just a little closer, his hand brushing against mine again. Slower this time, deliberate, intimate, and I knew in my heart that nothing would ever be the same. It was late afternoon when Jesse returned the following Tuesday, the sun, low, soft gold filtering through the trees. I wasn't working at my desk. I didn't even have a reason to be outside. I was standing at the edge of the yard, pretending to check the flower beds, heart hammering in anticipation. When he pulled into the driveway, I caught my breath. He stepped out of the truck, tools slung over his shoulder, damp from sweat and the warmth of the day, and there was that look, the same one he'd given me for weeks. A quiet, knowing smile that made my stomach twist. "Hey," he said casually, but the timbre of his voice made it impossible for me to act normal. "Hey," I replied, voice tighter than I intended. He moved toward me, hands tucked into his pockets, but there was a slow, deliberate ease in his stride. When he reached the hedge line, he leaned down to inspect a branch. I stepped closer under the pretense of helping, though I knew it was just an excuse to close the distance. Our hands brushed. Intentionally, I realized, as he didn't pull away immediately. My chest went tight. I swallowed hard. The sun, the hedge, the quiet neighborhood. None of it mattered anymore. All I could feel was him. His fingers grazing mine, lingering on my wrist. The warmth radiating from his body so close it made my knees weak. Then he looked up at me. Really looked. The teasing grin softened into something unreadable, something intimate. He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the heat of him. The faint scent of his sweat, mixed with something uniquely him, grounding and electrifying at the same time. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance. My hand lifted almost instinctively, trembling, and he mirrored me, our fingers intertwining with a quiet, deliberate slowness that made my pulse jump. I've been wanting this," I whispered, voice catching, unable to believe I'd said it aloud. His eyes darkened just slightly, but it wasn't anger or surprise. It was intensity, acknowledgement. "Me too," he admitted, voice low. And then, without another word, he leaned in. The first kiss was tentative, almost shy, but that hesitation melted instantly. His lips were warm, firm, confident, brushing against mine in a rhythm that made the world around us disappear. My hands found his shoulders, my fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt as he pressed closer. The hedge scraped gently against my back, unnoticed. The sound of the street faded. Only us. Only this. Only the electricity pulsing between our bodies. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me. His lips were flushed, eyes sparkling with something I'd been craving without knowing it. "Been a long time coming," he murmured, voice rough with emotion. I laughed breathlessly, heart racing, shaking my head. "Yeah, far too long." And then he kissed me again. Deeper this time, hands sliding to my sides, fingertips tracing the lines of my ribs, grounding and intimate. I felt a surge of warmth, heat pooling low in my stomach, a mix of anticipation, relief, and undeniable desire. Minutes stretched into eternity. Every brush of skin, every gasp, every heartbeat brought us closer. The quiet backyard, the fading sunlight, the rustle of the leaves, it all became a private stage for a connection that had been simmering for weeks, and now, finally, it was real. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, foreheads touching, I realized that nothing about this felt rushed or reckless. It felt right, honest, electric. "Next week," he whispered, voice low. "We finished trimming together." I grinned, heart pounding. "Definitely." For the first time in years, I wasn't content with quiet. I wanted more. And with him, I knew I'd found it.